Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Jason Edwards, and welcome to part one of a two-part LinkedIn Live and YouTube Live series on the Medal of Honor. Over the last several years, I've edited a weekly magazine and written a 10-book series called Beyond the Call Medals of Honor. These have all been focused on World War II awardees and the real people behind the official citations. I would ask that you consider looking at the series or even picking up a copy of which all 10 are now available on Amazon. To do so, please visit militaryauthor.me. Before we watch the film, I want to step back and talk briefly about how the Medal of Honor itself came to be, much of which you may have never heard of. For example, when the Civil War began, the United States military didn't have an official combat decoration. We were very leery of European things, and that was considered a very European thing, is to have all these medals and decorations. But as the casualties mounted in the Civil War and leaders saw incredible individual acts of bravery, they realized they needed a way to formally recognize those moments. In 1861, a Navy Medal of Honor was created for enlisted sailors and Marines, followed a year later by the Army creating its own version for soldiers. And with no other decorations available, the Medal of Honor was sometimes given for things that wouldn't qualify today, including extending enlistments or such as the military escort for Lincoln's funeral. They were all awarded the Medal of Honor. After the war, hundreds of medals have been issued, and senior leaders began to worry that the award could lose its meaning. That concern led to reforms in the late 19th and early 20th century. And by 1897, the language had hardened around conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. In 1917, a review board was formed to revoke more than 900 earlier medals to restore the medal's integrity. Now, these medals were not taken back; they were still kept by the people who had them. But the actual official act was no longer in the records. But as the services evolved, the medal's appearance changed, but its purpose did not. So what I'm going to do now is going to show you the medals themselves, the design, the three different ones, and how they evolved. So this is the Army Medal of Honor. And the first edition, of course, was in 1862. And it had a very Civil War motif, as you can see between the two versions, 1862 and 1896. And of course, it was the Army. We'll talk about the Navy when the Navy one was first. So the Army pretty much copied most of the Navy one, except for the fact of the cannonball and the cannons and the eagle at the top. And one thing to notice that you see different about the medal today, of course, is these were pinned on the uniform, right? The medal today, as you'll see in the current version over there, is a ribbon device, right? Sorry, it's a neck device worn around the neck. In 1904, the Army decided to go with a more modern approach on it, and what we have was called the Gillespie Medal. Now, Gillespie was actual General Gillespie, who had earned the Medal of Honor in the Civil War, and he took it upon himself to go out and design a new Medal of Honor that was then issued by the United States Army. And the only change after that was in 1944 when it became a wearable around the neck medal. Now, look, it's like the Navy. So the Navy was had the first Medal of Honor in this says 1862. It should be 1861, I believe. But it had also a very Civil War motif between the two. And as you can see, it kept the Marine, the nautical kind of flavor with it, with the anchor and the star as you go through it. Now, what's interesting, though, is in 1919, the Navy hired the Tiffany Company to design a new Medal of Honor, and you have what's called the Tiffany Cross. Now, this was in service until World War II in 1942, until it was changed to the current version, which went back to that Civil War motif and the simple anchor, right? If you can see here, the anchor was removed from the clasp and it was added back. And of course, this is also a neck device. Now, the last one, not really the last one, the next one we'll talk about is the U.S. Air Force. Now, is the U.S. Air Force. Now, the Air Force became its own branch of service in 1947. Prior to that was the Army Air Corps for its brief existence for that couple of decades, and of course, in World War II. However, the Air Force didn't finish designing and issuing a Medal of Honor until 1965. So in that period, even though it was the U.S. Air Force, any Medal of Honors that were given, for example, in Korea, were given under the Army Medal of Honor. So, and as you can look at it here, the Air Force medal is quite a bit different than the other two. One, it's got the Statue of Liberty in the center. It keeps kind of a little bit of the design, a little bit of the Gillespie medal, but it has wings and it's thunderbolts and lightning arcing through it. And of course, the word valor underneath of it. The last one, of course, is the Coast Guard. And while they were authorized a medal in 1963 by an act of Congress, the Coast Guard has never designed, minted, or issued a Medal of Honor to this day. The only person who's ever won the Medal of Honor from the Coast Guard was Douglas Monroe, and he earned it at Guadalcanal in World War II. And it's actually in one of the books that I wrote, which is a great story. It's a fantastic story using his landing craft as a shield between advancing Japanese and wounded Marines to get them off of the beach. The stories of the Medal of Honor are not just stories of people being brave under fire. So let's be clear. Brave is a basic prerequisite for serving in combat in the U.S. military. These are stories of those who charge alone into machine gun fire, who hold a position when everyone else has fallen back, or who throw themselves on grenades, or keep leading and fighting after wounds that would stop almost anyone else. And unfortunately, more often than not, they don't survive the action that earns the medal. The film we're going to watch comes from the U.S. Army's Big Picture series. It shows how the Army once chose to tell the story of the Medal of Honor across the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and Korea. It also includes wars in the West after the Civil War. It also includes the Spanish-American War and a few others in there as well. It's polished and poetic. It's really nicely done, and it fits the era that it came from. As you watch, try to listen to the way it talks about above and beyond the call of duty and a company of heroes. And then in the back of your mind, imagine the raw, specific reality underneath those phrases. And you're going to see them again and again in citations throughout the history of the Medal of Honor. And with that context in place, let's roll the film and see how the Army told the story of its highest decoration. Let me get the film started, and we'll be back.
A company of heroes assembles here, men long dead and others living still. In this corridor, where honor is paid the deeds of men who through a century of wars have earned the medals and decorations of the nation's military services. Ghosts whose bodies sleep at Shiloh and beneath coral beaches on islands burning in the sun. And the spirits of other men who live today to remember what it was like at Bastogne, or on a carrier at Leyte Gulf, or in the skies above Korea. All are represented here, in this hall where heroes walk, wearing the proud symbols of service with distinction, symbols lustered with the gleam of gallantry, commemorating courage under the pressures of combat, spanning the spectrum of human bravery in its severest tests, culminating in the greatest symbol of all, the Medal of Honor, awarded in 2 versions, for gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life, above and beyond the call of duty. Man is a faltering animal. He weeps, he bleeds, he falls and fails and feeds on the insubstantial stuff of dreams. But there's also a nobility in him, a clean, hard gem of splendor, packed into the frail clay by the hand of God, the source of those virtues which are his special glory, and which enable him to raise his eyes to the stars even when his feet are in the mud. Such a virtue is his power to love. Such is his knowledge of beauty. Such is his courage. Men, in their tribes and the societies they have built, in their homes and nation states and in their armies, have always honored courage when they found it among their own. For this quality, courage, bravery, whatever name we call it by, is the royal virtue. And men, when they see it, glimpse the nobility of their line. In its reflected glow, all men are kings. History gave us, as a nation, particular reason to prize this virtue when it imposed upon us its special challenge to win independence in a test of fire. Beginning with the tattered army which wrote the word patriot in steel and smoke on the emerging mind of a young nation, beginning there, brave men carried the American dream in their stout hearts and fought for it and died for it in every test of strength and will our nation faced in its first century. They were unsung, most of these early heroes. No medals were forged in their name or their honor, for we were still rebelling in those days of our lusty youth against our old world heritage. And medals, we thought, were the trappings of Europe's armies, not those of a young democracy. But before that first century was over, came the conflict which shook this nation to its fundamentals and marked in deep suffering the beginning of its maturity, the Civil War. So nobly conceived, so proudly constructed, the American Union now lay bleeding and perhaps dying. Searching in its agony for the promise of its future, it found itself looking into the eyes of its sons. For here now, more than anywhere else, lay the meaning and the hope of the American experience. The nation had shaped the man. And now, in a moment of historic crisis, the man carried whatever hope existed for the nation's continued life. Whether the Union endured would depend heavily on his personal faith in the Union's cause and his ability to prove that faith in the most demanding of all tests. With courage, and a grateful people in the midst of war forged a medal to honor that courage. In the swirling fury of battlefields which scarred the American heart, the Medal of Honor was born. The Civil War was deeply felt on both sides. The cause to each was sacred. Bravery wore a gray uniform as well as blue. But in the perspective of history, the preservation of the Union was the greater cause. And the Medals of Honor awarded to the Army, Navy, and Marines in that war are testaments to brave deeds which gave us the Union forever. In the war of its birth, the Medal of Honor was the only award for gallantry in action. Later, other medals would be created to commemorate bravery in all its forms. And in the process of this distillation, the Medal of Honor would emerge as the supreme award, earned only by gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. With the tragic war over, the nation took up the heavy task of binding its wounds. The guns of the big war were silent now, but on the western frontier, the fires of another kind of war still flamed. Charged with the task of making the frontier safe was the regular army. Out west, that meant the cavalry. The enemy was no soldier in gray now, but a bronzed warrior in buckskin, lashing out suddenly against a beleaguered stockade. In the hot and dusty Arizona sun, in the biting, freezing Nebraska snows, into the face of danger hundreds of times the cavalry rode. Rugged, leather-skinned soldiers on horseback, in their defense of the frontier, they bore the brunt of the attacks of hostile tribes. Many men who fought their lonely battles and died their lonely deaths in this distant America which has passed into legend, won medals of honor. The names of their battlegrounds are obscure now, most of them, but some still ring in our national memory and always will. Names like Little Bighorn, where saber-wielding cavalrymen outnumbered but not outfought went down under the onslaught of the Indian charge. In the hard, grinding years of the Indian Wars, 415 Army men who fought America's battles on those distant plains were to receive the Medal of Honor. Not all of these heroes lived to hear about it, but for those who came after, their names have passed into golden legend. It's 1898 now, the century of consolidation, of cataclysmic change, of division and reaffirmation is drawing to a close. The nation hears the first faint echoes of history's insistence that it look beyond its own shores and take its place in the world at large. In Cuba, Havana Harbor is shaken by an enormous explosion, one whose thundering reverberations sound from shore to shore in our land. The explosion is caused by the sinking of the United States battleship Maine, sent to Cuba to protect Americans during the Cuban battle for liberty against Spain. The cry, "Remember the Maine," sweeps the nation. And none shouted it louder than a band of rugged men called the Rough Riders. Led by Theodore Roosevelt, they were to be in the vanguard of the force to land in Cuba as allies of the Cuban people against their Spanish rulers. Roosevelt and Colonel Leonard Wood recruited about 1,000 men who were to be good shots and good riders. And a tough and hardy lot they were. Their greatest day was July 1st, 1898. Their objective was a crucial hill in enemy hands. To reach it, they had to advance under deadly fire every bit of the way. But they made it to the top. And history recorded the charge up San Juan Hill as one of its most stirring chapters of courage in combat. 30 Army men were to be paid our nation's highest tribute in that short but fiercely fought war. Together with 81 Navy and Marine fighting men, they were the first to win medals of honor on foreign soil. The Spanish-American War wouldn't be the last time America's soldiers would fight on land far removed from their own. The end of that war brought international responsibilities, and over the years these responsibilities would grow. And an America which had believed it could lock its interests behind its own frontiers would be shocked into an awareness that trouble in a faraway place might well signal a new challenge for American troops. We who live in this tense and global day have learned to live with that idea. But to those of an earlier time, suspicious of foreign entanglements and foreign adventures, the idea was shattering. Consider, for instance, the shock to America in the first year of the new century, when it found that developments in far-off China called for the presence, the fighting presence, of United States troops. Thousands of fanatical Chinese laid siege to foreign embassies in the capital city of Peking. As engagements go, the Boxer Rebellion was a minor one. It occupies little more than a footnote in our military history. But brave men fought there, and some of them won the Medal of Honor. And of these winners, one man's courageous action has come down through the years as a symbol of the kind of courage which the bravest of the brave have displayed in all wars. He was a bugler with an infantry regiment. The Americans and other forces trying to relieve the besieged embassies were blocked by a 30-foot wall. The bugler's company commander called for a volunteer to scale the wall. And the young soldier's ringing response, "I'll try, sir," has become an example of high courage and an inspiration to infantrymen ever since.
Scarcely a decade after the Boxer Rebellion, United States Army soldiers were riding through the dry desert dust south of the Mexican border. A Mexican bandit named Pancho Villa had stirred up deep trouble by destroying American lives and property. An American expeditionary force had been sent in to eliminate the trouble.
One man was awarded the Medal of Honor in this campaign. One man. Always it's been America's fortune to have that man, that member of a special breed who served beyond the call, there at the moment he's needed. But if the nation had felt the need of him up to this time, as certainly it had, it could hardly face the challenges that lay ahead without him. For now, the door to the new world, the world we live in today, was opening wide. And events beyond our control, but not beyond our interests, were driving us irrevocably into it. The shape of this world would be determined largely on fields of battle, reluctantly but inevitably. For now we could do no other. We would take our position on those fields far removed from the American continent. The war America entered in 1917 was a new kind of war. The truck and the tank and the machine gun had come, and combat was never to be the same again. The war that lay waiting for the doughboy was one of massed firepower and long trench lines facing each other across the graveyard of a no-man's land. Americans fought a vigorous offensive of small units sweeping through fortified German defenses, taking the war out of the trenches in which it had been stalemated. What kind of face does courage wear in such a war? The one it has always worn. For the face of courage does not change, however much the weapons and tactics change with which the courageous man fights. In World War I, that special courage, summoned by the man who takes his life in his hands to do what must be done, above and beyond the call of duty, wore the faces of 95 brave men of all services. Courage in battle did find a new proving ground in World War I, the air. The airplane had barely emerged from its experimental status, and now it was a formidable weapon of war. And the ranks of Medal of Honor winners who had fought on land and sea were increased by men who wrote their records of bravery in the sky. World War I, with its particular call on bravery in a kind of war new to the world at that time, saw the introduction of the airplane in combat. Scarcely a generation later, a second world war came to America on the wings of the same machine, now a highly developed weapon of destruction. 14 million Americans served in uniform during this greatest and most destructive war in history. 430 of these would earn the right to wear the Medal of Honor in virtually every spot on the globe where Americans fought. And how would each man win it? By standing for a moment in time alone, lighted by a fire which kindles in all men, but rages in a special few in special times. Who was he, the man who served above and beyond the call of duty in World War II? He was a Marine from Ohio, a private first class, serving on Guadalcanal. His machine gun emplacement took the full brunt of an all-out assault. His orders were, hold the position. All through the night he held off the Japanese. Weary and exhausted, toward morning, he did not see an enemy soldier approach until too late. Then, determined to save his comrades, he leaped up, absorbed the violence in his own body, and yielded up his life. He was an Army platoon leader whose unit was pinned down by the Germans, blocking an American advance. Ordering his men to cover him, he went forward alone and destroyed the enemy's stronghold. When his job was done, he brought his men forward, and in the process, memorialized the heroic stance of leadership wherever men fight. He was a naval officer, commander of a submarine coordinated attack group off Truk Island. He alone of the group possessed secret intelligence information of our submarine strategy. He carried out his secret orders, and the enemy paid dearly. Then, all at once, his own flag submarine was rocked and battered by Japanese depth charges. The damage was soon beyond repair. The commander decided to surface the flagship and engage the enemy in a gunfight so the men might have a chance to abandon ship and live. But for himself, the decision he made was considerably different. Rather than risk capture and possibly reveal secret plans under enemy torture or use of drugs, he decided that he would remain aboard the vessel. He would stay with it in its final plunge to the bottom. He was a flying colonel who led a mission which seemed incredible in 1942. One which started with bombers being lifted from the deck of an aircraft carrier, where these planes were destined for Japan, and the Air Force then had no suitable airfields close enough for them to leave from. In those dark early months of the war, the mission of these volunteer airmen electrified the country with a thrill of hope and pride. They carried the war to the enemy, to a confident Tokyo which then believed itself invulnerable to attack. So audacious was the mission, so daring in conception and performance, the Japanese defenders were caught by complete surprise. The attackers came roaring in over the Japanese mainland, and first blood, the first of much to follow, was drawn from the enemy. He was a general of the army who sent a thrill through the Allied world by returning victorious, as he had promised, to a land he had been forced to withdraw from in the face of overwhelming forces. Not many general officers have won the coveted medal, but it is meaningless to talk of the Medal of Honor in terms of rank. Generals can win it, and corporals can win it, and admirals and seamen. Bravery knows no rank, and it knows no station. The medal can be and has been won by every kind of man our society has produced. It can be won in wars of all kinds, as it has been in our time, from the mighty epic of a war that stretched across the world to one localized on the narrow peninsula of Korea. In the hills of this divided and far-off land, Americans faced communist guns for the first time. Korea was a war of symbols. It was freedom itself which was attacked, and it was in the cause of freedom that men stood and fought. But behind the symbol, it was a war of flesh and steel. The fighting was bitter and intense. 131 Americans who fought here joined the select ranks of the bravest of the brave. Some fell, some lived. Some understood clearly the contribution to freedom's defense they made. Others perhaps saw the issue dimly. But each of them reached the summit of America's Pyramid of Honor by a supreme act of bravery above and beyond the call.
With the Korean armistice, the guns of Americans in war were silenced. The last brave deed in combat was recorded. And thus, in a sense, the story of the Medal of Honor to this day is closed. The heroic adventures of the 3,156 who have won it in a century of wars are preserved between the bindings of official histories. And all are woven into the living legend of a people and a people's spirit. But for this very reason, the story of the Medal of Honor is not ended, and indeed cannot end. But the particular essence of the medal is not what it is, or even the epic tales of those who've earned it, but more than anything else, what it represents. That precious quality which Lincoln called devotion, transformed in an atmosphere of danger into a courage whose presence ennobles man. Such a quality does not die. It lives unflowered and unseen. But if it's needed, it's there. Once more, America stands in crisis. And, as in other days, searching for the promise of its future, it finds itself looking into the eyes of its sons. Their defense of freedom is a silent one, but most solidly real. Their mission, urgent in the eyes of mankind, demands more of patience and skill, of effort and adjustment and quiet determination than it does of courage. They train so that war, with its special call for bravery, will never come. But the seeds of bravery lie there, and they will blossom if they must, in fields where they have grown before, where they have always grown, in the stout hearts of men. The links in the soldier's tradition are strong ones, and the heritage of those who serve today reaches far. And most prized of all in this heritage is the tradition of courage, refined into the special quality whose presence is felt here in this hall of glory, where ghosts of heroes walk, keeping vigil on a nation's pride.
Sorry, it just took me a second to figure out how this thing works, I guess. All right, so what you just saw was the big picture, of course, and it's a sign of its time, and it was meant to inspire the country during an era that it was made. It gives us a type of mythical framing of Company of Heroes. It's talks about the sacrifice beyond measure and the idea that courage is something almost larger than life. But when you dig into the individual stories, right, the letters, the stories, the after action reports, you find something even more powerful. The people who earned the Medal of Honor were almost always just ordinary Americans. They were scared, exhausted, cold, hungry, angry, and under impossible pressures. And in that one moment, they made a choice that changed everything for them and the men around them. That's the part of the film it can't fully capture, but it's the part that makes the medal real. And in my Beyond the Call series, these moments come alive in a very different way. They're messy, chaotic, and human. And they remind us that the Medal of Honor isn't just about perfection, it's about someone stepping forward when survival is unlikely and still doing it anyway. Next time in part 2, we'll take everything you saw today and connect it directly to several recipients who lived these moments in real time. Then we'll watch the second part of this big picture film. Thanks for staying for this conversation. And if there's a specific recipient or battle you'd like me to focus on next, drop it in the comments or message me here. I'd love to include your suggestions in the future. And if you could, please check out militaryauthor.me and pick up a book full of heroes. Goodbye until next time. Thank you.